This is the KuKirin G2, the smaller sibling of the G4. Smaller motor, less power, smaller battery. However, it might be this year's best buy at the entry level. Let me show you. If anyone happens to feel a sense of déjà vu, it's not by accident, because I already introduced the G2 last year, and at first glance there doesn't seem to be much difference between the two scooters. Of course, there are differences. The manufacturer has improved a few things on the scooter. In this video, I will introduce it, focusing mainly on what has changed compared to last year. Are these changes good or bad? And of course, I'll also talk a bit about what it was like to use this scooter. Let's start with the unboxing and assembly, because that's the simplest part of this whole thing, since the scooter arrives almost completely assembled, as you can see. You only need to attach the rear fender and the handlebar. Everything else is already in place. Yes, I know, setting it up is a complicated process. Don't give me a hard time. I know that over-tightened screws need to be loosened. Loose screws need to be tightened. And at the pivot points where the metals meet, you need to apply grease. So there are a lot of things you need to do in order to set up a scooter like this properly and to be able to use it normally in the long run. But as for the actual assembly, after taking it out of the box, it really just comes down to putting on the fender and attaching the handlebars. You check the brakes, and basically you're done with the assembly. The scooter specifications haven't changed much compared to last year, so it still has the 800-watt motor, which has a peak output of 1,200 watts. The size is the same, the weight is the same. Everything else has stayed the same. What has changed is the brake disc, because the manufacturer replaced the 140 mm discs with 160 mm ones. Before I tell you what it was like to use the scooter and what its flaws, weaknesses, and strengths are, as usual, I will introduce it first. So let's take a look at what KuKirin has created for us here. Let's start with the government, because there aren't too many changes here. The control cluster on the left side has remained the same as before. We have a turn signal and a horn. On the right side, we have the power button and the throttle. Of course, there are brake levers on both sides. I don't think that's going to surprise anyone. The power button is not only for turning on the dashboard, but also, for example, to change the speed mode. There are 3 speed modes, which you probably won't really see because this dashboard turned out to be terribly bad. But maybe you can see it now. There's an eco mode, a standard mode, and also a sport mode available. These are the 3 different driving modes that you can choose from, depending on your preference. So the dashboard would be relatively informative if you could actually see anything on it. But you really can't, because it reflects the light terribly. It glares. The protective film has already been removed from it. So this is how it looks from the factory, just as you see it here now. It also has a touch-sensitive surface. For example, I can turn the light on and off here. I don't know how well you can see it. The point is, if I could see where the buttons are on it, I could switch the functions here, even without physical buttons. By the way, the handlebar turned out to be relatively wide, which is good news. And what's also good news is that we get a standard stem, which means that if the handlebar isn't wide enough, if we don't find this handlebar wide enough, we can take it off and put on a wider one. Obviously, only as much as the cables, brake lines, and other parts allow, but they'll definitely allow for some adjustments, so you can put on a slightly wider handlebar if you want. The opening and closing mechanism from last year's scooter, which lets you fold down the handlebar, has been retained, but the deck you stand on has changed somewhat. Last year, the screws were still hidden here on the deck underneath the rubber, which was a pretty silly solution. Now, the manufacturer has placed these screws on top here with rubber gaskets underneath them to prevent water from getting in. This is a small change. The rear deck has also changed. More precisely, this heel support has become much larger, more stable and stronger than on last year's model. The rear light has also changed. On last year's model, it was positioned a bit further in, underneath the heel support. On this version, however, it has been placed out here, almost at the very end of the heel support. Unfortunately, this hasn't really improved its visibility, as you can probably tell, because this light turned out to be terribly poor. I'll go ahead and turn it on now so you can see for yourself. This is all the light it gives off. Okay, it's daytime now, so at night it's probably a bit better. But this amount of light is not much, and the turn signal is just as useless. I'm just flashing here with 2 tiny little lines, and on the other side as well. If I switch to the other side, This here is the turn signal. This is supposed to indicate which way we want to turn. Obviously, it won't indicate it, or even if it does, no one will see it. The fender hasn't changed compared to last year's model. It's the same solution, and it has a reflector on it. This part hasn't changed. What has changed, as I mentioned, is the brake disc. Compared to last year, we've got a 160 mm brake disc instead of the previous 140 mm ones. So that's definitely a good thing. However, the mechanical brakes remain. The rear swing arm hasn't changed, nor has the shock absorber that's located between the corner support and the swing arm. You can clearly see that there's no trace of grease here, so these are the spots that need to be greased during setup to make sure that metal doesn't touch metal directly and that there's some medium between the two. Okay, so we have a charging port here which is sealed with a rubber cap, and we also have a front wheel which has the same 160 mm disc as the rear, and it also has a mechanical brake just like the rear. As you can see, the tires are not off-road, but rather have a tread pattern designed for hard surfaces, and they are 10 inches in size, tubeless. The front suspension hasn't changed much compared to last year. The manufacturer has reinforced it a bit, welded a slightly different shaped piece of metal inside, and added an extra triangle on the outside here. Last year, this part wasn't closed off yet, so this also strengthens the swing arm. What's really good about this swing arm is that it's relatively short, so the manufacturer was able to open up this C shape quite wide. And why the open C means that the wheel is positioned somewhat further back, which reduces the tendency for wobbling on this scooter compared to other scooters with similar C-type suspension. What else should be said about it? Well, the deck is a fairly good size, even for my foot size, which is between 43 and 44. The motor, of course, is in the rear wheel. In addition to the disc brakes, you also get an electric brake, and that's about it. I think I've covered everything that could be said about the exterior. It has kept last year's slightly industrial design. You can see that it's a pretty striking, good-looking scooter, which competitors have already tried to copy. And there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet. That's the front light, which turned out just as bad as last year's. We get 3 LEDs, which aren't very powerful and don't illuminate in a very good direction either. The only positive is that the turn signals have been moved to the top of the headlight housing, so from the front they might be somewhat visible. Of course, this visibility is mostly true only if the sun isn't shining directly on them, because if it is, you can't see the turn signals at all. So let's just say that at this point there's still a bit of work to be done on this. No matter how nice or stylish this headlight housing is, and no matter how good these lights look, overall it still doesn't quite fully serve its intended function. And I think I've now covered everything about the scooter's exterior. So now let's move on to what it was like to use this scooter. Let's start with the fact that it's very important that the scooter really is 800 watts. I have to mention this because a lot of manufacturers play tricks with this specification and list the peak power on paper, not the actual continuous power. KuKirin provides the actual power rating, stating their scooter is 800 watts with a peak of 1200 watts. And based on my experience, this is accurate. I usually take the same routes with every scooter, so I know a more powerful scooter can climb hills or how far it can go up a particular incline, while a weaker one can't. On the test hill I used, the G2 performed exactly as you would expect from an average 800 watt scooter. I couldn't make it all the way up. I was only able to get about halfway, maybe 2/3 up the hill, but definitely not any further, no matter what tricks I tried. And perhaps this is the only flaw of this scooter. It's relatively lacking in torque. No matter how fast it can go, no matter how much the motor spins, there just isn't a lot of torque in it. However, because of this fast revving, since the motor can run at relatively high RPMs, it is able to reach the top speed specified by the manufacturer. They say that you can go about 45 kilometers per hour with it, and what's interesting is that even I, weighing over 90 kilos, can travel at 45 kilometers per hour with it. I don't really like to elaborate on the range figures because, for example, in our area there are a lot of hills, and doing testing I put quite a lot of strain on the scooter, and well, I'm not exactly a small person either. It's by no means certain that what I tell you will turn out exactly the same way for you in reality. So I always prefer to share the rule of thumb that compared to the official specs, you should expect any electric scooter to achieve about half to 2/3 of the stated figures. Obviously, this depends on factors like the temperature, your weight, and how many hills you have to climb. Okay, but what was it actually like to use the scooter? Well, as I mentioned, this is a relatively good scooter in the sense that it's very agile, accelerates well, and is fairly nimble, at least considering it only has 800 watts and is relatively heavy since the whole thing is welded together from large metal parts. In my opinion, the brake with the 160mm disc can really be better than the 140mm one, although it should be a little better since we're talking about a larger disc, but during use I honestly didn't feel any huge difference. Let's just say that I don't mind at all that a larger disc was put on the scooter, but honestly what would really improve the braking is if we switch to a hydraulic system. However, in this price range, a hydraulic brake just isn't feasible yet. The suspension is relatively stiff, but for my 90 kilos it was just right. What's really fortunate though is that the suspension stiffness is adjustable. So if you're lighter than me, you can adjust it, customize it to your body, and the scooter won't bounce excessively, for example, when coming out of a turn or on rougher road conditions. In my opinion, the 10-inch wheel size is good for this scooter. Obviously, I prefer 11-inch scooters, but for a scooter of this size, I think 10 inches is more than adequate. As I mentioned, the tire has the city tread pattern, so the manufacturer definitely does not intend this scooter for off-road use, or at least not for rough terrain. If you like, this machine is somewhere in between the serious scooters and the small stick scooters. So if you don't want to ride around on a 350-watt stick scooter that dies on the slightest incline and has no suspension, then a scooter like the KuKirin G2 could be a good option for you. Of course, with the caveat that because of its weight, it's not very easy to transport, so you won't be able to use public transportation with it. It's harder to fit into your car's trunk. You need a larger trunk for it. So these disadvantages are obviously present compared to a stick scooter, but with the KuKirin G2 you get a longer range and a safer riding experience. And finally, one very important thing is the price of this scooter, because it's incredibly cheap at least compared to the level of service it can provide. The price of this scooter is currently under 170 forints from a European warehouse. Depending on the dollar exchange rate, you can currently buy it for about 167 forints. Under the video on YouTube, you'll find the link and the coupon code where you can purchase it. Well, that's about it. If you like the video, choose one of the other two tests appearing next to me. I'm sure you'll enjoy those too. And come back because I'll be posting more scooter reviews and other tests later this year. Enjoy the summer, be good, take care of yourselves, and goodbye.